Welcome, everybody. We are also currently going live on Facebook right at this moment. So we are getting that going, and we are letting folks in from the waiting room, and we will get started shortly. But thank you all for joining us tonight for The Legend of Zelda and Theology. Okay, it looks like we got most everybody in from the waiting room. So hello to everybody both here on Zoom and live on Facebook, and perhaps watching it later on Facebook or YouTube. My name is Ember Kelly, and I am the Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York. Always a little bit of a handful getting all that out. I am joined tonight by our amazing Assistant Director of Religious Education, Colin Wulff.
Hello all, thank you for having me, Ember. Excited to talk about this. Thank you everyone for joining us.
And welcome to our first of what is hopefully going to be like a continuing series of what we're calling pop culture and theology, where we kind of take a look at something relevant in general pop culture and see like some of the deeper meanings in it, see if it's got connection to our own searches for meaning. And today specifically, we are looking at The Legend of Zelda. And so, let's see maybe a show of hands of who knows what Zelda is, who knows about The Legend of Zelda. Okay, I'm seeing a good few hands here. Yeah, that looks pretty positive. I know we've got a few people who've told me they didn't know a ton, so it's okay to also not know a ton. And we're going to have a little brief introduction, and hopefully I have watched enough Legend of Zelda videos recently to be very much able to give you a good quick summary. So Legend of Zelda is a series that has been around, I think this is the 35th anniversary this year, has been around across multiple Nintendo consoles, so for all the way from the Super NES and the NES up until the present day, ranging from a variety of like top-down, very pixelated titles to currently the most recent one was an open world exploration title, Breath of the Wild, and they've had all sorts of various adventures in between, but all of them tend to focus around a few things, and that is that there is a hero, usually called Link, a princess, a queen, some person of that variety, named Zelda, or sometimes a similar name, usually often with an A at the ending, and then some sort of evil power that most often relates to a figure known as Ganondorf or Ganon, but that's also a bit of a further discussion that we can talk about as we go into this. But so all of these are like quests. You go on quests to complete tasks and gain the weapons that you need to face this ultimate evil and to bring balance back, only to have to do the same thing in the next game a few years later. And so Colin and I have prepared a few questions to get us kind of going in our discussion, and we're going to kind of just have a very conversational back and forth for a little bit about some of the stuff that we've discussed in preparation. And then towards the end, we will open it for public discussion. If you're on Facebook, feel free to leave questions and we'll come check there. But then as we move to the public discussion on Zoom, we will stop sharing it live on Facebook so that everybody can feel free to share. And so we will have a little bit of time for that at the end as well. If you come up with something that you're really interested in hearing and want to see me and Colin try and go for the answer on. So Colin, would you like to kick us off with our first question?
Sure. All right, we got in the chat. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Triforce and the Trinity. So the Triforce is the great sacred symbol of this game series. There's a creation myth involving three goddesses, Din, Faror, and Nehru, and they are respectively the goddesses of power, courage, and wisdom. And the Triforce, which I think Ember has a visual aid there to show us.
So, conveniently, I brought the Zelda encyclopedia with today.
right, is a representation of their efforts in concert, right? But it's not just a symbol. It also has an actual locus, sometimes at the gate too, sometimes within something called a sacred or golden realm. And it is both most powerful when it's fully intact, but it is divisible. If someone touches the Triforce and doesn't have that balance of qualities within them, of those virtues of courage and power and wisdom, then it will fragment. And there will be a sort of equilateral stigmata on the hands of three incarnations of those virtues within Hyrule. Which is the world in which this series takes place. There are some adjacent or nearby kingdoms that are sometimes referenced, but in the original creation myth of Hyrule, it is described as though it is the world itself. So religion, not just Christianity with the Trinity is what might come to mind for a lot of Western viewers, but mythology and faiths of the world are replete with trios of sets of virtues, also of goddesses. We have in Greek myth, there's tons of them, the Gorgons, the Furies, the Graces, the Moirai or Fates. But then of course there's Northwestern European pagan beliefs, and there's pre-Islamic Arabian triads that are similar and pair sets of goddesses with particular virtues. So Ember, what do you think, why this set for Zelda? Why wisdom, courage, and power? Do those three complement each other well? What is their function for the player and the mythology?
Well, so one has to wonder if, the Triforce was perhaps just invented as this thing to get, but it does seem to serve like a pretty solid like story basis, that it's about discovering these character traits in the characters and in the world. So I think that it's this to some level this image of balance, that like these three factors are kind of often at interplay in our world, that like there's courage, that people have to have courage to do the right thing. People want to gain power. Is power always bad? There's a question to be considered. Wisdom, what is wisdom? I mean, I think that's the one that as I prepared for this, that I really was like, okay, Zelda, she's this character that oftentimes is very silent, held captive, but yet she's portrayed as this incarnation of wisdom. So like, what exactly is wisdom? So I think it's really interesting that these are the three chosen thing. Like power and courage, those ones kind of make sense in a story of epic struggle. But like, where does wisdom come in to balance that out? And like, why is it this princess who's often a little bit quieter in the story, unless she's in disguise, but who's the wise one? We don't often see her wisdom on display. In the more recent game, Breath of the Wild, we do see that she's like researching some of the technology and things like that, and so like it shows like this bit more academic side. But like besides that, in some of the other games, it's been a question of like, what is this wisdom that she has? But yeah, I think that it's interesting that they did choose to go with this number 3, which like has so much religious significance, like in different cultures and different things. As you said, the Trinity, and definitely, even like the mother maiden crone imagery, and like more modern day paganism. There's so many of these sets of 3, so it kind of makes sense. I mean, plus, I feel like a lot of people have really cool Triforce tattoos now that the series has been out for a while. I have not gotten one yet. But I think it's interesting, and I think that perhaps one of the things that really interests me is like how it's so often split apart, like that it's not, it talks about it in the mythos that like this is this thing that's always together, but in nearly all of the stories it's split apart. So what do you think about that, about like that that these things are always seem to be separated, and it's on the player to like figure out what to do with them in the game world?
Yeah, so the idea that you can be tested with the degree to which you have managed to combine all these traits through the encounter of the entryway to the sacred realm, that has kind of a tinge of Zoroastrianism in it, where their recommendations are good deeds, good thoughts, and good words. And if you follow that roadmap, then when the time of judgment comes, if you have balanced those out, then that will be a determining factor about where you end up in the afterlife, the sort of dualistic judgment of the paradise of songs. Music plays a very strong and theurgic quality in the Legend of Zelda series as well, or in Eternity in A House of Lies. It's funny that wisdom is the one that you're a little more hung up on. For me, it's courage is the one that I kind of think of as the odd one out. That's the one I have trouble really reconciling as completing the set. And so I guess the way I try to fix that is I apply it to what is the player's experience with those three. You know, Legend of Zelda kind of distinguishes itself from other kind of hack and slash fantasy adventures like, I don't know, Gauntlet Legends, in that it really emphasizes a puzzle solving element. It emphasizes in interactivity with the citizens, the inhabitants of that world. It emphasizes an altruism on their behalf. So it's not just about the acquisition of powers, which can then be unleashed on mindless AI hordes, but it's also about actually trying to observe your environment and follow its signage to the ends that you're trying to achieve. So wisdom there is pretty clear to me in terms of how the player is challenged to rise to that occasion. And then power, of course, that is probably the most straightforward of the three in a gaming world experience. You want to level up. You know, you want to get the artifacts, you want to increase your health meter, and then you want to wreak havoc on the antagonistic forces. So power is pretty straightforward from a typical gaming perspective. But courage, I can only if I try to square that with both a gaming experience and a wider kind of cosmological set, I have to sort of translate that into just will, the raw awareness, the decision and volition that is playing, that is continuing in the game. And then wisdom guides the decision-making process within the game, and then the power is the degree to which you are actually equipped to influence the environment of the gaming world. So that's kind of how I think about that, anastomosing the in-game cosmology and then the challenge put to the player. Does that
Yeah,
seem...
no, definitely. When I think you hit on there, one of the things that you and I had talked about as we prepared for this is that we have experience with different versions of the games, that you're much more familiar with the earlier games, and I'm much more familiar with like Wind Waker and on, including Breath of the Wild being my most recently finished game. And you hit on it though, that that things can change so drastically between each of these games, that and including the Triforce itself, and how the Triforce is appearing. In Ocarina of Time, it's very much about like this establishing much more of the mythos of the Triforce, whereas in Breath of the Wild, the most recent game, the only time you really see the Triforce is just when Zelda is using some sealing powers, and so there's not really a discussion of that this is this is what the Triforce is in this mythos. It's not quite there. So it's interesting how the games can so drastically change, and how also each person is going to bring such a different perspective to each of those games, and to take away just completely different meanings. I joke about watching lots of Zelda videos, but there's thousands of them on YouTube that are just poring over every little detail and connecting it to a detail in another game and putting together these elaborate theories, because each person is going to approach this. And I think that that's the interesting thing about this, about what you said there, is how you for you, it's courage was the one that seemed strange and out of place. So each of us even experiences the story a little bit differently, which I think is a really great thing. I know that the creators have talked about that Link, the main character, that the reason he's called Link is because he's your link into the world. So, what is your thoughts on that? Like that your relationship to the games, like what does that mean to you?
Yes, well, I had perhaps an even more of a kind of a path of least resistance in projecting myself onto Link, because I encountered this game when I was a little blonde boy, and so that just happened to be just some iconography that I could link myself up to very easily. But something that struck me about Link from the outset, in comparison to equally perhaps or more famous mascots even in the gaming world like Sonic or Mario, you can sometimes name a save file when you're playing a Mario or a Sonic game, but in The Legend of Zelda you are given the opportunity to actually name the character. I don't know of any Mario games in which in the game world you have named Mario after yourself, and the characters in the game world were talking to Mario use that name, right? It's always they're addressing that mascot. That mascot is married to his particular personality, his particular set of powers that sometimes changes, sometimes expands. But he hasn't undergone the same kind of revolutions of garb and look and shape and age that Link has. And so, that on its own grants the player a certain ownership over the character. They are placing themselves within the game world. They can name it whatever they want. Sometimes they name it after themselves. Every middle schooler thought that they were the only one who decided to put something, lewd and ridiculous in there, so that the players, myself included, so that the in-game players, when they would address themselves to Link, would say something obscene or ridiculous.
Choosing perhaps fart over here, when they're being called out to.
Exactly. But I think that element of ownership over Link is pretty important because until Breath of the Wild, which you just mentioned, these games have not actually been completely open world, role-playing, construct your character from the ground up series of choice-making adventures, right? There has been always this combination of linearity and choice, of a teleology of Hyrule, clear platforming elements, the world constructed with signs of design for play really evident in the world, and elements of the world that look more like they're actually adapted from an organic nature, open for discovery. And so giving the player that extra sense of control over the identity of this avatar, whoever they are, I think help to offset and even mask in many ways that essential linearity and determinism of the world. And that was one of the topics that we wanted to hit on.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that to some level, even with the limited choice available in some of the early games, that this was a lot of people's first experience with. I don't know that many people. I think at the time where people used the term adventure game, and even Breath of the Wild they call open air game, because they always got to come up with a slightly different title. But it was probably for me before something like Final Fantasy. It was the closest I had come to the idea of a role-playing game, that you were on this grand adventure that it was up to you to figure it out, versus okay, I'm going from one side of this screen to the other, and I'm gonna jump over things, and I'm gonna get the bad guys, or I'm gonna get to the top of this stage in this Mario 64 or something like that. This was the first experience. Interestingly enough, that you bring this up, how Breath of the Wild does this differently. Despite being very interested in Zelda from gosh, I mean, as a kid, I would borrow it from Blockbuster, and I would. But the thing is there was always a save file that was pretty much already done. So I would just get on there and I would play with the already completed character, and I would just go explore around the world. And so I actually never despite just growing this huge fascination with this game world, and playing most of the games since, at least that have came out on consoles, I played Wind Waker, or I played Ocarina of Time. I never finished it. I played Wind Waker, nearly finished it, but never finished it. I played Twilight Princess, got 40 hours into it, and I never finished it. And then with Breath of the Wild, suddenly I think the open world aspect kind of did lure me in a little bit more to spend the time. Just I often like those games where I can just kind of wander around and do things, and it was kind of refreshing. But I think that you were right, though, that the base game itself still had this sense of wonder and wanting to explore, even if there was limits on it. And that was such a different experience for those of us who were raised with maybe Mario at the time. So I don't, what was your experience growing up with the games? How many of them have you beaten?
I think I've only beaten 3, and those would be the 3 that I have, which is A Link to the Past, for the Super Nintendo, and then the 2 Nintendo 64 titles, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. It's funny that you describe it. I've observed a lot of them playing, and I've played at friends' houses, and I'm at least conversant in most of the entries. But you described kind of a journey of hopscotching from game to game until you encountered that one that really just spoke to you, and it was the really open-ended one. My experience with Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, which for those of you who have played the games, they play very much with the cycle of time, with repeating patterns, with going back and forth between childhood and adulthood. My experience with those two games is one of repetition. I will play through Ocarina of Time and then give it a 1.5 to 2 year gap where I won't touch it, and I'll dust it off, and it'll be like new again, and it will go over and over like the like the heroes' reincarnations. But you described that difference between the open world Breath of the Wild, massive experience that I think a lot of gamers are used to now. For me, I play Breath of the Wild, and that's the one that holds my attention for the least amount of time compared to Ocarina and Majora's Mask. I guess maybe a little bit there's a bias of theatrical perspective there, because I think of my imagination is really just kind of fired up by the idea of suggestive minimal spaces that get as much as they can out of a bounded venue. And so it's about the granular approach. It's about the crevices. It's about making a second totally thorough sweep of each of those little connected rooms that comprise a very kind of impressionistic forest. And so I kind of I would almost prefer to have a virtual reality experience, which these games are, in which as long as I can't actually be in that world, I would almost rather it be bounded and then see the implication of infinity or grandness trail off into the inaccessible wings. That impressionistic theatrical effect is one that I'm just really attached to. But Breath of the Wild, it's almost I'm almost overwhelmed by its bid to replace my real reality with its scale.
No, definitely. Well, I know most recently, I've been playing through Link Between Worlds on the DS, which is a Link to the Past, basically remixed for the present day with some different setups, and technically, it's a sequel that remakes it as well. But one of the things that I really did actually like about it, and what you were kind of talking about there, is that you can get this mastery of it, that I was going around and just getting to know every little area, finding all the secrets and looking for everything and meeting all the people and talking to them and figuring out who everybody was. There is something nice about that as well. I think for me, I find such richness in both styles, that sometimes it's okay that life has that really strong structure and routine, that a game does too. And sometimes it's just really nice to hop in a game where I can even though I've put probably 60 hours into Breath of the Wild, recently I was playing, and I was just wandering to a random corner, and I encountered a whole person, a person with a whole story that I had never even heard of before. And that was it was so it was so amazing to me that I had played for all these hours, that I'd watched all these videos about the lore of Breath of the Wild, and yet I still was discovering these new characters. But then at the same time, there is this richness to having this world where you can become the best at it because you've conquered it so many times.
Right. And what are the implications if we were to circle back to the conversation about these demiurges and creation myths? What does it mean that there are so many different incarnations of ostensibly the same world? Why can we both go back to Hyrule and have this massive open world experience, and also this smaller sense of bounded connected rooms experience? How are they all Hyrule? What does that mean for the lore?
Yeah, so one of the big things, as you were talking about, was this idea of time, of the hero repeating it again, just like you repeated your playing of the game. And so one of the perhaps most interesting, and maybe even I dare say controversial aspects, is how Nintendo as a company has tried to make sense of the Legend of Zelda lore, aided by a community of people that have always been trying to piece it together the first two, you know, were pretty straightforward. Like you're this guy venturing around on this map and you find things. And Link to the Past brings in a little bit of a story, but doesn't like try and link itself to the previous one. I get to say link a lot in this, which is, you know, just appropriate. and then you get to Ocarina of Time, which presents like a story that's very much in the same vein as Ocarina of Time, but like also completely new and different and bigger, but also once again isn't like, oh, well, this Princess Zelda is the third niece of the Princess Zelda found in the Zelda #2 or something like that. They weren't trying to put in this meaning. They didn't quite, you know, understand that in the future we'd have YouTube and we'd have this means to sit around pondering all these connections between the games. But then the thing was with Ocarina of Time is they followed it up with a sequel so that it wasn't something where it just introduced a whole new world, but it did at the same time. So it was in the same world, but it was a different world in the same world. Do you want to talk a little bit maybe about Majora's Mask as we talk about like the whole repeating of the stories here?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I want to take you up a little bit also on just what you introduced to the conversation, which is the idea of the kind of extended, interconnected, mythopoetical universe that is all these different Zelda installments, and that obviously there's a little bit of retconning there, right? We get to the now the 35th anniversary of this franchise, and just as we see happening with things like Star Wars, which is now so outsourced across different platforms and companies. There can get a point probably of diminishing returns at a kind of after the fact effort to reconcile all these different installments that were just in the early days of this series, like with George Lucas's A New Hope, just this kind of almost avant-garde attempt to see if this stuck, and it was just trying to make it to the end of this instance of that interesting idea, and then it blew up, and we are hungry for cohesion, we're hungry for for pattern making and purpose, right? And so, fans attempting to interlink every installment of the series will run into frustrations, but it's a fun kind of cerebral exegetical exercise, right? It's a creative process, and it's fun to try it anyway. But like you said, with Nintendo has now kind of formalized a canon of sorts, which introduces a whole new element into that conversation. I mean, I feel like it's hard enough. I sometimes describe religion in Legend of Zelda as kind of a beautifully incoherent pluralism, right? And it's bad enough trying to really make rigorous sense of the theology within a single game. You could imagine the king of Hyrule convening, like Constantine, an ecumenical council of sages to argue the canonical interpretation of the Triforce. Is it an emanation? No, it proceeds from the goddesses, but they're not subordinate to it. You could apply a lot of those same arguments that wound us up with the Nicene Creed to this fantastical contrived game playing experience, and that can be really fun recreationally, but we also inevitably run into, as often biblical scholars will, frustrations of actually conjuring up cohesion and pattern making across different elements when the authorship is so spread out.
You've got me kind of wanting to make like a fan game that's the Legend of Zelda and the Council of Hyrule. We can make a little fan game as someone who studied like Christianity's church history. Then I feel like I have that special ability to make this a reality. Maybe fan fiction will be good enough.
Historianism and the Triforce. Let's do it. Yeah.
So going back, Majora's Mask kind of hits on this theme of time and of being kind of disconnected, and you have much more experience with Majora's Mask than I do. I've watched a million lore videos, but I've actually never played it. And so like it seems to me that like this idea that Link goes to this other world where there's this imminent danger, but he can travel back in time. It seems so different than the structure of a lot of the other games. Do you think that there's different meaning to be found in Majora's Mask than like is seen in some of the other games?
I do. Majora's Mask is a personal favorite of mine, and you kind of see the approach of the series transition from a high fantasy to a much more kind of folkloric perspective. Whereas in Ocarina of Time, it's the entire hero's journey from boyhood to adulthood, and there is a really clear progression of power acquisition, and there's a great world implicating evil is vanquished. Majora's Mask substitutes the kind of, so for those of you not familiar with Legend of Zelda, the major kind of levels or landmarks of progress in each of those games are called dungeons, and these are we'll talk or temples. We'll talk about these a little bit more later on. We have a bullet point for it, but these are kind of elementally or regionally associated areas where the hero can test the skills that they've acquired up to that point. Ocarina of Time has I think not 9 main ones, and then a handful of smaller ones, maybe 10. But Majora's Mask transitions away from those big landmarks of prowess, which are sealed off from the world. The hero descends into an area that is designed to test them. Majora's Mask instead transitions into the side quest, basically a series of kind of vignettes that are much more focused on going on small missions in the actual, inhabited world on behalf of its dwellers. And so there are only 4 dungeon landmarks in that one, because it's much more concerned with actually keeping you engaged with the inhabitants of that space. And so it reads much less like a continuation of the epic saga. It's a direct sequel because they used a lot of the same visual assets, and it came out on the same platform shortly afterwards, but it doesn't really concern itself with the overarching and many times repeated battle of good and evil between the major recurring characters. It's much more about community. It's much more about interactivity. It's much more about kind of in the way we think of Arthurian legend, almost, different knights of the round table going out to make their essays, and they're not necessarily linked together, except in that we know they're part of the same mythos. So it's a much more kind of short story format that I find really gratifying, because I can kind of jump in whenever. It's populated with gentle and sometimes striking surprises. And the function of time works very differently between the 2 games. Ocarina of Time, you can go between the timelines as a childhood and an adult, so it's a time lapse of 7 years within that one game. Majora's Mask, we play with time a little bit differently. We focus instead, kind of like Groundhog Day, there's a 3-day cycle that you repeat again and again and again, and you become more familiar with your environment with each go through, until you find yourself adept at solving all of the problems that you encounter on that stretch. Time is a major through line of the series, and of course one that has a lot of theological implications as well. Ember, did you want to talk about that a little bit, get into the hero of time component?
Yeah, so we've kind of hit on it a little bit, that there's that Nintendo's put together this timeline, and so that one of the more recently released games, Skyward Sword, which came out on the Wii, which was actually quite a long time ago, but it's technically more recent, and so technically it is the first in the timeline that it establishes the overarching mythos, which then so it moves from in terms of the main games, from Skyward Sword, and then that timeline moves pretty straightforward with some smaller games down into Ocarina of Time, and then Ocarina of Time splits off because of the time. And so in Skyward Sword, they set out that there's this hero that helps this Zelda character, who turns out to be an incarnation of this other goddess Hylia, who is trying to help humanity. And so so this hero helps save her from the incarnation of power and evil that tries to conquer the world. He's this demon king Demise, but he curses them at the end of the game, saying, well, now all future generations will still have to fight, the same battle that, I won't ever, I will always be haunting them. And that is then seen as coming true in Ganondorf. So then where the timeline splits again is that they talk about the hero of time. So the main character of the Ocarina of Time becomes known as the hero of time because of his traveling back and forth. But So they have 3 timelines because, so since he switches from child to adult, at the end of the game, spoilers for anybody who hasn't played like a multi-decade old game, at the end of the game of Ocarina of Time, Link returns back to his childhood, which then moves into Majora's Mask. Some people have said that's about processing trauma, but that is for psychology and and the Legend of Zelda. But so he goes back to the childhood world, and that creates one timeline. But then the adult world that he also saved, where he's no longer, becomes a timeline. And see, we have a courtesy of Colin. I will really quickly pin you, Colin, if I can get my computer to cooperate. Or Colin, if you want to just turn on your speaker and let people, so people can hear you a little bit better with the picture
Sure.
you got there.
Yeah, so it's just a little side comparison of those 2 timelines being split, the hero as an adult and the hero 7 years earlier as a youth, and the Master Sword, the taking up of the Master Sword, which is what that weapon is called, is what provides the key to that transformation, that transformative growth.
And so you now have these 2 timelines, but then there's also the creation of another timeline, which is the world where he loses to Ganon, which is called the Dark World, and these sages have to come together and seal Ganon. And so much of the later mythos is around this main hero of time, like that becomes like the focus of how to understand the overarching story and branches of all the different parts of the story. But it's interesting. Like I saw one of the points raised. So what every time that he dies fighting a random enemy in Ocarina of Time, does that mean there was a new timeline created? Does that mean that there is the world where nothing happened because Link died fighting the guy in the first dungeon? Is that its own timeline that we will see someday? Luckily, like the most recent game, Breath of the Wild, tried to resolve this tension by just completely ignoring everything and moving it 10,000 years forward and not acknowledging all of the different stories, including a character from Majora's Mask who technically existed in an alternate dimension. And so you have this game that brings it all together while setting itself so distantly in the future that it then really tries to make reference to the idea that these are legends, that these are the legends of Zelda, the stories that are told of this hero of time, of the warrior of Twilight, of the sea sailing warrior in Wind Waker, that these are all legends so long ago that like people know of them in like in their religious context, but that these are just legends, and that's how they've lost this ability to put precise timelines together and have all of them coexist in one. However, that being said, they once again play with time in the most recent installment, which was a spin-off game, and they play with time in that. I will not spoil that since that one technically only came out like 2 months ago. I will not spoil it, but they play with time again, technically creating a new timeline. And so this idea of playing with time and being so involved with time seems to kind of follow him, Link, everywhere since the Ocarina of Time. In Link to the Past, he traveled between 2 different worlds, but it wasn't any switch in time. And so there's this element that he's become this hero whose journey continues across incarnations, across lifetimes, and sometimes they try to make it sound like he's the next hero is maybe from like a line of family related to Link, but most often it's that like this, that the hero just arises when they need to. I can't help but think of the promise that was Star Wars: The Force Awakens. But in that first advertisement, when they say the dark rises and the light to meet it, sort of thing, this idea that like when the world is threatened, the courageous one will rise to the challenge, no matter the incarnation, no matter the timeline, that someone will be there, and that person is the player, the link to the player, and you are there to save that world. I don't. Do you got any? I see some nods of your head, so I'd like to give you a chance there.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. That when we talk about reincarnation, which is a concept that crops up in a lot of different faith and philosophical traditions, a lot of different permutations of that, and thinking of the player as the consciousness that is the through line to all these different incarnations makes a lot of sense. if we kind of bring a meta-narrative component of implicating the designers and the player into the video game, which, as you know, one of the most interactive art forms, I think we must, the mythology actually kind of starts to answer its own questions in a way. But yeah, even within the game world, reincarnation is played with differently. Like you say, it seems in some cases it's a actual spirit being recycled and manifest in different vessels. Other times it has more to do with an actual royal pedigrees, so ancestry rather than actual spiritual recrudescence. Breath of the Wild in particular really has a kind of a Platonic strain in it. In Plato's dialogue, The Republic, he ends with the myth of air, where he talks about his vision of what reincarnation looks like, and it has to do with you are in the between state, between lives, and you decide if you are in a position to do so based on how well you lived, more or less the role you want to occupy in your next life. You drink from the river of forgetfulness, Lethe, and then you are reborn. And so because you have lived a past life, you retain some basic intuitions about how to interact with the world in Plato's vision, but the actual memories that connect you with a really particular identity are washed away. And so as we encounter things in the world, as we learn, that process of learning is actually one of recollection. And that is essentially the entire theme of Breath of the Wild. Woken up, kind of suspended in a pool of water, and you have some basic instincts about warrior instincts coursing through you that allow you to kind of cobble together an early start in this world. But the entire journey is about rediscovering that previous identity. You want to talk a little bit more about that, since you have more experience with that particular game?
Ooh, yeah, and I really like that interpretation of that, actually. This the idea that you're, that this is almost a past life regression, and modern, perhaps more hippie psychological sense, but that Link is uncovering this thing while still having some intuition, which then relates back to this idea of like what is the meaning of the player being there. So like you as you play Ocarina of Time repeated times, you become more skilled at it each time. And so you have become a better player by your 10th playthrough versus when you were a young child playing it for the first time. And so like, in some sense, you're coming to it with this memories of your past Zelda experiences. But at this, and then connecting it with something like what you were saying earlier, for you, Breath of the Wild was the strangest because so much of your past Zelda experiences were these much more structured, whereas like my first really big Zelda experience was Wind Waker, which, while it was straightforward, allowed for just sailing the ocean endlessly, as much as you wanted to, and exploring and seeing what was out there. And so since that was my like foundational experience, when I saw Breath of the Wild, it was like, this is the part that I loved about Wind Waker. And so, we, just like Link, we come to it with these memories of what we liked from the past games and how our skill levels, So one of the things I've gotten, as you know, as someone who helps me with religious education on Sundays with the kids, my own son Jude is quite obsessed with The Legend of Zelda right now, but he has picked up. He was struggling a little bit with Breath of the Wild, but we got him Age of Calamity, and he's in learning all of the dynamics of this game, and he's learning how to play it, and he's gotten quite good, and I've been pretty impressed. And so, what is his future Zelda game going to be interested in? If this was his first big experience of playing Zelda, then what is his memories that he will bring forward as the next Link?
Right. and we kind of assume once a franchise gets to be 35 years old, which for some players of Zelda is longer than they've been alive, we kind of start to assume that it's just an ingrained institution now. But what if it isn't? What if it concludes? How could they tie up all the threads at this point? If we were to take a more kind of if we were to take a different approach to the idea of reincarnation than Plato's, and imagine, an attempts to follow the dharmic path until you have, followed the path of the right enough to reach, nirvanic retirement. Will Link and Zelda ever achieve that? Are they, bodhisattvas who have definitely accrued enough goodwill points to do that, but still choose to remain behind again and again and again to help the actual inhabitants of the worldly plane? But when will they get to retire? When will it be enough? When will the series conclude? Ever? Is that desirable? I don't know.
When can they truly defeat Ganon? Like how many times must Ganon be defeated? Like, and with so much spacing between some of the times of these stories, like, it's hundreds and thousands of years, that like how often does it come back? Is it like literally every generation that like there's this big threat, or is it like every like couple hundred years? Yeah, there's so much to be dived into there. So I want to steer us towards, so you talked about it a little bit earlier about like the intentional design, especially in the older games. So I wanted to talk a little bit about temples, and then have that kind of be the last of our bullet points. And then we had 2 user submitted questions that we wanted to briefly consider from our Google form that people signed up on. And then we can also start opening for other questions. But so temples, we're talking about the theology of Legend of Zelda. You got to talk about the religious encounters of Legend of Zelda. And each game you have something generally called a temple of some sort. I think that one's pretty common across all of the games. So what are these temples? Do they come across to you as a place of actual worship, or are these places of exploration and growth and like kind of this sense that we must reach our best self? So what has been your experience with the temples?
Yeah, it's a good question. I admit I go into these temples through the in-game avatar of Link, and I look around them and I think, this is really not layperson friendly, this space. Anyone going there who isn't equipped with divinely imbued artifacts is not going to last very long. There are bridges suspended over lava, design flaw. So if they're not really just, there are two things come to mind. One, we're just seeing them in a time of invasion and corruption. We were often sent into the temples as Link to purify those spaces of the elements that have stormed the keep, really. And then you could also think of it, even in the best of times, as something that is specifically designed as a proving ground for the hero. And but does that mean that that there this hierarchy, it has to be totally static, that no regular congregant could find that in themselves and storm the keep and overcome the trials therein? I don't know. It seems to me that a lot of them are designed specifically with a particular treasure, with a particular set of powers, and with a particular hero in mind. And so that's not especially democratic. It's not especially service friendly, And so that is the first thing that strikes me about associating these video game levels with a name like temple as a place of worship. What do you think about that? What's your impression?
Yeah, some of them are definitely, much more dungeons in that sense. As I said in the chat, you call this a design flaw. I think personally that, lava moats sounds like a really great idea for Fourth Universalist. I'm not sure if Skylar's still on the chat, but if you are, Skylar, just please note that for future renovation ideas.
Does that count as landmark preservation still? I don't know.
I think so. Who wouldn't think it's a landmark? So, I think that with the knowledge of Ocarina of Time I know that there is like the Spirit Temple, which is the Gerudo Temple, basically. And it's much more like religious looking. And you have like the Temple of Time and the Sacred Grounds and all of this and some of the other games. But besides that, most of the other ones definitely seem much more like just places of adventure versus places to be worshiping at. But interestingly, like I feel like in the more recent games, like so you had Wind Waker, which didn't really necessarily call a lot of things temples. You just went to these dungeons, and then you had Twilight Princess, which then returned to like the idea of temples, I think, a little bit more. But then Skyward Sword had like the Sacred Ground, which became like the Temple of Time later on, and other things. And then Breath of the Wild has like this Temple of Time has these religious gathering areas that like have now been destroyed in the world, but that at one time these were like places of religious pilgrimage, and so I found it interesting that they did try and finally like actually like take up that religious part of all of this, like so this actually ties in quite well with one of the user submitted questions, player submitted. If we use Zelda language, one of our it was about basically, what is the faith of like Hyrule, and is it an interfaith? Are they all practicing different religions? Because we have different. One of the things we haven't even talked about is that there's Gorons, the rock people, there's Zora, there's fish people, Rito that are bird people later on, and there's even like two different branches of them. There's the Koroks in the most recent ones. There's all of these different people groups of very different experiences, and then there's like the stereotypical humans. So do they all share this belief in like the three goddesses, or do they all have their own things? I know that with the Spirit Temple, the Gerudo, who are the people that Ganon, the bad guy, comes from, that they have like this goddess that they believe in, like the sand goddess. I think is the name off the top of my head. I might be wrong. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But so what is the religion of, do you get the feeling that like each of these groups has their own different religious experience, or do you think that they all kind of share the same general belief, and how does that maybe change over time?
Well, it's always interesting to bring questions of belief and faith into an in-game experience where theophany is kind of a regular occurrence, where magical powers and the spirits to which they are owed is a demonstrable, practical element of the world. What does it mean to say I do or don't believe in that particular in-game circumstance? So I don't, and yet words like subjective words like legend do get thrown around. My understanding, anyway, with the games that I've experienced with the Ocarina in-game world, I suppose I would probably use a word like henotheistic instead, because it seems that there is local differences of belief and of sacred objects and of megafaunal guardian entities like the giant whale Lord Jabu, which you go inside of like Jonah, but they don't necessarily deny the existence of adjacent tribes or peoples, their sacred objects or ruling entities, and so there is pluralism there, and it's not mutually exclusive, and so then there's regional objects and entities, but it does seem that they are still tending towards that. Those three goddesses of the creation, towards the Triforce. You don't hear a word, at least in my Zelda gaming experience, you don't hear words like heresy so much. Even the antagonists within that world, like Ganon, acknowledge the Triforce and desire that it be whole, acknowledge that it's at its most powerful when it's whole. Right, so it's so I don't know that I'd call it interfaith, but probably henotheism at the regional level has elements of polytheism because the three goddesses are involved, and has elements of monotheism because they all tend towards that unified symbol of the Triforce. So again, it goes back to that that beautiful ecumenical incoherence of the whole series.
So, I'm telling you, after this, I'm just going to spend the night writing the fan fiction of the Council of Nicaea taking place in the Legend of Zelda world. So you mentioned Ganon there, talking about how Ganon does long after this power, like that even as the bad guy, as the devil of the series, that he is still wanting the thing that like the goddesses have. So one of the submitted questions, and something that we had kind of pondered already a little as well, is so like Ganon is like the holder of the Triforce of Power in this one. Is power inherently evil? Is Ganon inherently evil? What is this idea of Ganon continually, of evil continually coming back each generation? What does that tell us about evil? I'd be curious for some of your thoughts, and then I'll share some in response.
Sure. Yeah. Again, I think that the series is more that if there is to be a moralistic and ethical takeaway, the series is more focused on balance than on impugning any one of those virtues. So power is a part of the playing experience, right? The Link gets a lot of it by the end of the series. He gets enough of it that he's able to confront the keeper of the power third of that Triforce. He gets magical artifacts, he gets spells, he gets allies, he gets a horse and various other steeds that aid him on his journey. So power is not something that the player is taught to shun necessarily. It's the wise and willful exercise of it that is cautioned. But yeah, there is certainly that dualistic element. There's no question that in the Legend of Zelda series overall, and this is a criticism gets applied to the Lord of the Rings mythology a lot as well. Aren't we a little far along in the human experience to still be talking about good versus evil? Sure, and you can't really break away from the fact that those series do represent those objects, that there are incarnations of those ideas. But within those two poles, there's also a lot of ambiguity. Majora's Mask, which we touched on briefly, it kind of makes ambiguity its staple. There are characters along every step of that gradation, and sometimes evil isn't represented as a pure physical incarnation. It's represented in what Augustine would have described as privative evil, in that evil is something that works on good. It is the loss of good, it is the straying from good, it is decay and corruption and deterioration. So evil is necessarily requires that there be good as a substrate in the first place, and that means that all evil has a connection to good. And so there are characters that exemplify this, ones that start out antagonistic, and we realize that there's some personal issue going on, and when they're relieved of that pressure, they become allies. There are characters who, when everything's going well and they're at their best, they behave uprightly, but when things fall apart and the invasion begins, we see them, key into that more craven element of themselves. So yes, this series does establish signposts of good and evil. Can't get away from that, but it does populate the space in between, I would say.
Well, I was going to say that perhaps it's the courageous and wise use of power, to refer it back to the Triforce here to get us all three. And so, yeah, I think that it's interesting. And I think that to some little, like, I don't know how much it is in just like for a regular gameplay experience, but they hint at it a little bit in the mythos that like maybe like the royal family isn't quite so perfect. Like in Breath of the Wild, there's these Sheikah that have had to like basically like repress their technology because the like royal family feared it, and there's the Hyrulean Civil War that took place before Ocarina of Time, and other things like that are kind of put in there as like well, maybe it's a little bit more complicated than just like this guy wants to ruin everything. But yeah, they definitely, I think with establishing the mythos that they did with Skyward Sword, they definitely made it like, that there's this evil that just keeps coming back. But I like what you said about thinking about how evil just tends to be part of having good in the world, having beautiful things, that some people will take that power and not act courageous and wise with it, but instead twist it to be just power and pure power. And I think, yeah, there's definitely, stuff to be looked at there with any game like this. Like are people, as one of the questions phrased it, are people inherently a hero or a villain? Like it's a good question. Like we don't. I don't think in life that I think to some extent in life we assign hero and villain status to people, especially in a very media obsessed culture as we are. But I think that we know that most people are more complicated than being just pure evil or just pure hero. Yeah, I think it definitely kind of happens in stories like the Legend of Zelda, that it becomes this hero versus villain. But I do appreciate when they try to make it a little bit more complicated.
Well, thinking about the light and dark world motif that comes back so frequently in this series. You always start out in the so-called healthy or light world, right? And then whether because of a time lapse or because of a parallel world or an overlaid spirit realm, you see the degradation of that world exercised, but you can never get away from the template of memories that was instilled by that world at its healthiest, right? So throughout the game sees evil as something that has to be applied to a baseline of at least neutrality. And we can never fully escape that, even when, in Ocarina of Time, one of the most famous moments when you draw the Master Sword, you go to sleep for 7 years, you wake up, suddenly you're an adult. It blew the minds of many children who had, maybe never even played a 3D game before, myself included. And then you come out of the Temple of Time into what was once this vibrant, bustling burg of Hyrule Castletown. And it's ravaged by fire and storefronts that you once frequented are devastated, and the town square is filled with zombie creatures. And so you aren't looking at a perfect incarnation of evil. You are looking at what was left of something that you attached to. And so I think that is always wanting to tend back to a positive baseline is something that the game repeatedly shows us every time that it uses that model.
That has me thinking about, so first of all, if you're watching on Facebook, leave a comment now if you have a question before we end the live stream on Facebook. If you want to type a question, feel free to go ahead and leave it in the chat. If not, we will let people speak. We will give the powers of unmuting, they will be loosened. But one of the interesting things about the most recent game, Age of Calamity, which is a prequel-ish of sorts, of the Breath of the Wild, is it gives you this look at what this world, where you've seen it all in Calamity, like you've seen the downfall of it. What did it look like before? Which is, kind of the opposite of the normal Zelda experience. So we started with seeing this broken down world, and now we're seeing the put together world. But I do think it's interesting that they give us this ability to look at, to see the world as neutral or as good, and then see, what it would look like with things changed in the dark world. I know Link Between Worlds does that as well, as kind of playing on the same sort of thing. But yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I'm gonna go really quickly, check the Facebook, see if we have usually a minute delay there, see if we have any questions on there. But if not, we would love to field some questions from you all. So let me take a look here while you guys go ahead and either queue them up in the chat box or hit your raise hand emoji or raise your hand for real, and Colin and I can take a look. But I just want to check our Facebook before we end that live stream. It looks like we are good. Thanks you to any who have joined us on Facebook or future YouTube recordings.